This is a video on how to configure Burp Suite for websites that require form-based authentication. Generally, what Burp does is it stores its authenticated cookie in the cookie jar and use those cookies while scanning. But should that cookie become invalidated, um, the scan might end up with false negatives, and the areas of the web application that requires authentication um, would not be properly assessed. So it is important that you properly configure your scanner. In this case it is Burp Suite, but whichever scanner it is, to understand how the authentication of the web application works, and you configure it to properly know the difference between a valid session and invalid session. So let's see how it works with Burp. You know what Burp does is it lets you capture the authentication request responses, and then it will be able to repeat those requests and responses in a form of macro. So let's see what our authentication requests look like. So far as it made a get request to login form. All right, this is the login form. This is the post request that will log you in. And I believe we should be logged in right now. Alright, so we are logged in. Now let's look at this request in the HTTP history. So I'll remove this request just for the sake of simplicity. This is the request that will log you in, but as you can see there is a CSRF token. You cannot repeat this token. This token needs to be derived from a request that comes before. Response to the request that comes before. So as you can see here, CSRF middleware token. So I'll just highlight these three requests so that it is easier for us to find this request in a macro. Now we'll create a macro. We'll call it data login. I'll re-record the macro to the request that now while configuring the macro, you can see there are different fields. The two most important fields are derived parameters and preset parameters. Derived parameters are parameters that will be derived from the response to the request before. So for example, the CSRF middleware token will be derived from the response of this request over here. And preset parameters are parameters that are preset. They do not need to be derived from a response to the request before. So it is very important to know which parameters needs to be derived from the response before and which do not. Generally, Burp automatically tries to put them in the right fashion, but as an analyst you still need to go through request and response and figure it out. So let's test the macro. Before we test the macro, let's just log out. Alright, so it seems that we did not receive any error. Now one of the ways you can check whether the macro worked or not is show response in the browser, and if this automatically logs you in, macro worked. There it is. And the other way is okay. As you can check it from here. So you add a new rule, blog auto login, check if session is valid. If session is invalid, run this macro. This is one of the other important parts where you need to tell Burp how to determine whether session is valid or not. In our case, if you look at different pages, whether you go to new post, you go to register, you go to forget password, you can see that there is a login button on top of every single request. So we can tell Burp that, hey, if you see some login in the source code, HTML code, you have to assume you are logged out. But it would differ based on site to site. So we just configured a rule to run a macro when session is valid. Now we need to determine the scope. So suite scope is generally, whatever target scope you have defined, and tool scope is which tools should check for this rule. So all the 6 tools, it's a good idea to have all these tools check this rule. You might have created a Burp extender that you may want to use. So you can check the extender box as well. But this box over here, this is another good way to verify whether your macro is working properly or not. So I'll check. What it does is when you are proxying your traffic through Burp, it will check the validity of the session. If session is invalid, it will auto log in you. So just for testing, it is a good way to know. So let's refresh this, and there you go. You are automatically logged in. I'll uncheck that box, and well, let's see what happens again. And it'll ask you for a credential. So as you can see, it is important to know which tools of Burp will require this. This is very, very useful when it comes to scanner, because as we mentioned before, if a cookie is invalidated, you would not be able to properly assess the area of the application that requires authentication. So this is a simple form-based authentication, but let's say if you are using NTLM authentication, it becomes a little trickier. You can go over here and do the platform authentication, and you need to add which type of authentication it is, what is the host, what is the username. If the authentication you are using is, let's say, single sign-on or SAML authentication, you would have to go through all the requests that happens during the authentication. You will have to capture all those requests, create a macro just like we did, and then validate in the same way we did whether the macro is working or not. So the technique for form-based authentication remains similar. You just need to figure out which requests and responses will take part in it. Please, so this is a video on how to configure Burp Suite for form-based authentication. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comment section.